nature. Elk doing elk things. Woodland creature doing woodland creature things.
Approached. Who's in charge here? A dark-haired and skinned man, tall for an Iranian, only an inch shorter than Eric, stepped forward. I am, he said bluntly, without even bothering to salute. Lieutenant Giles Felston. I see, Eric said calmly. He eyed the officers behind the man, all lieutenants. They were all junior lieutenants, too, and not a single one of them looked pleased with the man in front of them. As none of your senior officers survived, I'm going to add you to my own men. Told them. We'll pick up the 5th on the way, but we're going to be operating as one consolidated force. I don't think so, Felston replied haughtily. The 7th is mine, and I see no reason to give up command to a boy. Irritation flared through Eric's mind, but he controlled it. Lieutenant Felston, I am the senior officer here. I am assuming command. I have 10 years of seniority on you, you jumped-up little prick. Felston snapped back. Eric knew that if he didn't do something, Icarus was going to kill the smarmy bastard where he stood, and he couldn't afford that, not now. This time he didn't even bother to control his anger, allowing it to suffuse his voice and burn away the last of his uncertainty. Lieutenant Felston, he snapped, we have one mission and one objective. Do you know what that is? I don't give a... Felston began to say, glaring at Eric in clear contempt. Defend this city, Eric snarled, cutting off the fool's words. I will fulfill that mission, Lieutenant. Your offended ego means less than nothing to me beside that mission. You will obey my orders, or I will kill you where you stand for insubordination in the face of the enemy. Do I make myself clear, Lieutenant? For a long moment, Felston looked like he was going to continue, but then he dropped his gaze. And Militia Captain Eric Septon Tarvera, acting major in command of the 3rd and 7th Newport Militia Battalions, nodded sharply and turned back to the rest of the officers. As I was saying, he said calmly, we will move out as soon as possible to pick up the 5th Militia. We will then proceed to the Square of the Gods. The Square of the Gods? One of Felston's lieutenants queried. Yes, Eric replied. Where dragons can reach, we cannot hold, he said bluntly. We need to man the inner defenses, and I intend to detach troops from our battalions to be certain that they are manned. Once those defenses are manned, the Draconians will only be able to land troops, not bring dragons in for support. They will have no choice but to take the forts out on the ground, to allow their dragons clear access to the city. To do that, they have to take the Square of the Gods. You're going to put us straight in the path of their entire army? Felston snapped, a crack of whimper in his voice preventing it sounding strong as he lightly hugged. Eric turned on the man coldly. Yes, because that is our duty, and the only way we can hold this city. Understood? Ignoring the man, Eric turned to the other lieutenants. Each of them nodded in sequence. Finally, Eric returned their nods. Gentlemen, we will move out as soon as possible. However, the 7th is a mess. Therefore, as soon as possible will be as soon as your units are organized and ready to move. Get to it! Kalanis watched each wave of transport dragons come sweeping in to land on the edge of the city with satisfaction. The battle dragons swept patrols through the sky over the transports and the troops forming into their regiments. His hand caressed the lens on spikes one last time, and dismounted. My claw lieutenant, with the crossed quill and sword of a staff officer, was waiting for him. The youth barely looked old enough to shield, but he snapped off a perfectly credible salute to the Sky Major. Sky Major Colonis, sir? That would be me, son, Colonis replied. At ease. Your message. Sky General Adelis requests your presence at the command post immediately, sir. The youth barked out, his eyes trained at a point 6 inches above and to the right of Colonis' shoulder. Which is... what? The Sky Major asked gently. The youth flushed. Follow me, sir, he said quickly. Despite his perhaps excessive formality, the youth wove his way through the chaos of the forming battle formation with ease, guiding Colonis to a massive black dragon. Adelis' own shell. In the shadow of Shell's bulk, a dozen clerks and as many junior officers had set up folding tables and spread out maps, bustling around the general like planets attendant on the sun. Flat crystals were neatly lined up on one set of tables, and Colonis raised an eyebrow. He didn't know what they were, but he doubted Adelis had brought them for decoration. He didn't have much time to look around the impromptu command post, as the other Skyborn officers arrived at much the same time as he did, and all of them were brought to the general. Adelis was short for a Draconin and pudgy for a soldier, and when he faced his hard-bitten veteran officers, Colonis and the others found themselves coming to attention automatically. The general eyed them for a moment and then spoke. Gentlemen, well begun. Well begun indeed, he complimented. But well begun is only half done, and half done is far too early to relax. It appears, he continued, gesturing at the map of the city on the table before him, that our agents in the city failed to breach the inner defenses. While our information suggests that these forts are only lightly armed and almost completely unmanned in the case, they still represent a real and present threat to our force. With a jerk of his chin, Adelis indicated the regiments forming a perimeter. Our best guess is that between militia, regulars, and the King's Wing Guard, we're outnumbered by almost 3 to 2. While our men have been even more successful in eliminating the enemy's officers than we hoped, and it looks like the regular regiments have clumped together nicely for us, there remain a significant force. We must have the ability to provide aerial support. Colonis was a Draconin officer, a brave and valiant man sworn to the defense of his people. He hesitated not a second before stepping forward. Sir, the Green of Third is prepared to assault the defenses in the name of Draconin. He was less than a moment ahead of the rest of the officers, and Adelis nodded gratefully at them. Thank you, gentlemen. You have reaffirmed my faith in our men and officers. I refuse, however, to send a single battalion, or even several battalions, to attack these defenses. The forts are weak, but the losses will remain too heavy. You will all move in a strike that we will coordinate from here. How? Colonis could not help but ask. Adelis gestured for one of his staff to bring him one of the flat crystals Colonis had noticed. These, gentlemen, tablets. Once broken in half, what is written on one will appear on the other instantly. Colonis whistled silently. Magical communication. Something only water mages had ever managed before, and theirs was mind to mind. The general raised a finger. Be warned. The tablets are limited in both range and endurance. Otherwise, we would have issued them before we left. They'll be active for barely an hour after they are broken. Until then, he didn't need to finish the sentence. 12 hungry grins finished it for him. The fifth, thankfully, hadn't given Eric any of the trouble of the seventh. When he turned up and started issuing orders, even the officers present began more than willing to. They were in complete disarray, with what had apparently been socially fighting without any outside influence. Eric provided an outside influence senior to them all, and if that hadn't been enough, he brought nearly 900 armed men with him. If the fifth officers had to fight him, he'd been willing to lock every single one of them in chains and put their sergeants in charge. He was running out of time. Now he led the fifth and the third toward the Square of the Gods at a full march. He'd have ordered them to double time, but he couldn't. too exhausted to fight a close action, but they wouldn't need to. Enough of the guns and crossbows would be preloaded and charged that they would have some time to get their breath back before having to reload the weapons. With the 7th God, however, Eric only had 8,500 men, and he'd had to send messengers to the regulars and other militia battalions. There were too many Draconans in the city for him to feel comfortable sending men out in less than squads, so that pulled away another 150 men. So it was with a mere 700 men that Eric entered the Square of the Gods to discover he was too late. The Draconan force had already entered the square and was hot in the pursuit of what Eric presumed to be the 7th. He didn't have much time. He looked over at Icarus and asked, "Archers and charge? Only option." Nomcom replied, equally quietly, then grabbed the signaler marching next to him. The air raid raised his trumpet to his lips and blew a series of 5 notes, a specific signal. The last note was buried in the noise as a quarter of the men in the air raid force simultaneously came to a halt and drew their bows. The chain of command among the Red Dragon agents in the city had been all but non-existent. What there had been of it started to fragment when Brain had been killed, and the losses after the attack began had shattered what was left of it. There had been nobody to argue with Hendal taking command. At least no one had been willing to try. He'd taken as long as he dared to organize the force around the non-coms among the infiltrators, and the handful of agents he had to serve as officers. But the force was still a scratch-built mess. Scratch-built or not, it was the only force this deep into the city, and after the troopers he'd collected on his way to the Square of the Gods, it was 600 trained and armed men. If they could take the square, they should be able to prevent the air raid from manning the inner defenses. Or so Hendal thought anyway, until he entered the square, leading his troops from the front as Draconan tradition commanded, and spotted the air raid troops in the middle of it. They were moving fast and didn't look like they were stopping in the square. "They're headed for the forts," Hendal snarled aloud, the venom in his voice startling those around him. All his efforts, and it looked like he was going to fail this close to succeeding. With a shake of his head, the Red Dragon drew his sword. They were not going to fail. Not if he had anything to do with it. Fast, the air raid may have been, but they were still air raid. They simply didn't have the legs to outrun his people. "Take them!" he bellowed, pointing his sword at the air raid soldiers almost running out of the square. With a rumbling growl, the entire Red Dragon force surged after them at a run. The first few moments seemed to prove Hendal's belief. His people were gaining on the air raid troops. They'd been clever, but they hadn't been clever enough. The city would be the Draconans, and he would be the one who'd opened the way. He didn't realize there was another air raid force until the first volley of arrows dropped out of the sky like messengers of death. The shipyards burned behind the Green of Third. They'd been too close to the landing zones to be left alone, and the presence of most of the air raid regulars clumped together had proven too tempting for General Dalis. Colonus's orders had been clear, though. He was to make one pass through the Newport shipyards with the rest of the 3rd Strike Regiment to break up the air raid defenses, then move on to the inner city fortifications. He'd counted roughly 4,000 regulars in the defenses around the shipyards, but the strike regiments had ripped them apart. Fortifications were shattered and support weapons burned to ash. Behind the air raid's lines, they'd set dozens of under-construction ships, including 10 battleships ablaze. Further aerial support for the assault would require Colonus to succeed in his next mission. But with 5,000 claws of the dragon descending on the shattered defenders, the Sky Major didn't expect the Newport regulars to last another 20 minutes. Even if they held on by some miracle, the dragons had already destroyed every vessel under construction and every yard they were building. It would be years before Newport could repair the damage his people had done. Colonus's attention was distracted by one of his scout dragons screaming. He glanced over at the dragon, and its skyborne rider gave a hand signal and gestured down toward the city. The Sky Major looked down and saw what the scout was gesturing at. A battle was rapidly taking shape on the ground below. He cursed horribly and felt Lalen scream her sense of his frustration. His greens couldn't bombard ground forces. Their flame was too narrow, too focused. Their maneuverability made them good against fortifications, but they didn't have a wide enough spread to make strafing worth their while. Then his lips split in a feral grin he recalled the tablet resting in his saddlebag. He pulled it out and grabbed the stylus they had to go with it. It took a moment for him to locate the battle on his mental map of the city, but he'd memorized enough maps of Newport that it was only a moment. Enemy forces engaging infiltrators in Square of the Gods, he scrawled on the tablet. Request Blackwoods for Bouncing. The letters rested on the tablet for several seconds and then faded. A moment later, more letters appeared. A response. Adelis agrees. Black of Ninth is en route. Maintain surveillance. If the square is contested, the forts should be unmanned. Galanis flashed over his mental map of the city and nodded with a cold grin. The square was a choke point between the outer and inner cities. If there was a battle there, the infiltrators had probably stopped the defenses being made, which meant the Black of Ninth was about to do what the Fifth had just done to the shipyards to the only troops who could man those forts. Arrows pounded the Draconan force twice more before Eric's men hit it like a hammer striking glass. Neither force was heavily armed, but the Aradi had the impetus of the attack. The Red Dragons shattered, the militia driving deep into them. Eric stood in the first rank of his men, using his greater strength and size to help push the Draconans back. There was no time for tactics, simply the hammering of men against men. Even as the Draconan lines broke, Eric found himself cutting down a red dragon attacking Icarus, who stood by his side. A moment later, the Kept non-com returned the favor, casually gutting another Draconan before he reached Eric. The Aradi held their formations and the archers continued to fire, carefully aiming at the back of the Draconan troops, breaking their cohesion even more. Without any apparent organization, the Red Dragon force was doomed. Even as Eric came to that realization, he came face to face with what had to be a real Red Dragon. 4 Aradi troops lay dead at the man's feet, and Eric's hindbrain cataloged several other such knots of resistance, where the real assassins were just barely managing to hold together groups of troops. Eric drove forward without hesitation, lunging toward the assassin. His attack was parried, and the Draconan slashed at him, only to be blocked by Icarus. Eric shared a quick glance with his non-com, and then the pair began to circle the assassin. For a moment, the Red Dragon tried to keep his eyes on both of them. Quickly realizing he couldn't guard against 2 men, he began to retreat. With his eyes on his attackers, he wasn't paying enough attention to the ground, and he stumbled over an arrow-ridden Draconan body. In the instant of his stumble, both Eric and Icarus attacked. The assassin was good enough to parry Icarus's attack, sending the older air raid stumbling to one side as the Draconan spun toward Eric. No one could have been good enough to block both attacks, however, and Eric's old sky steel blade ripped into the man's side. The man's parry clattered uselessly off Eric's blade, and he crumpled to the ground. A moment's reprieve allowed Eric to pull Icarus back to his feet, but before either could say a word, the heart-wrenching sound of a dragon's shriek tore the air in two. Both men wheeled to stare up in horror as dozens, no, hundreds of dragons swept down on the square of the gods. Hendal had never imagined the sort of carnage the coordinated Aradi arrow volleys were unleashing on his ranks. Any chance of them catching the first group shattered under that steel-tipped ring, and was ground under when the Aradi infantry smashed into his men. The Red Dragon found himself caught up in the motion of his men as they split around the Aradi assault. For a moment, he was helpless, and could only watch as the soldiers, surely only militia, butchered his men like hapless sheep. Then the line reached him, and he found himself fighting for his life. One-on-one, he was far better trained than the Aradi, but the little sky men fought in groups, splitting the Draconans up and matching 4 or 5 of them, with their lighter shields and longer swords against each of the larger men. One of those groups came straight forward, and his blades sliced apart the soldiers around him. 2 soldiers managed to stick with Hendal in the chaos, and he faced the 5 Aradi with them at his sides. With a snarl, the assassin lunged, dodging nimbly around the longer sword of the lead Aradi to gut the man with his dragon claw short sword. As he gutted the leader, though, 2 more attacked him. He dodged one blade, but the other slashed across his shoulder, opening the arrow wound even wider. The other 2 had gone after the soldier on Hendal's left, who now lay on the ground, choking on his own blood, with an Aradi sword through his lung. The owner of the sword, however, was silent on the ground, the Draconan's blade having opened his throat. Even as Colonus raised his hands to issue his commands, the tablet burned red hot, and he looked down at it. Negative, it said flatly, in a script very different from the previous handwriting. Withdraw. The message continued. And then, in case he hadn't guessed who was giving these orders, the signature. Adelis. Gritting his teeth, Colonus gave the gesture commands to withdraw. Section by section, the skyborn of his battalion peeled back. Below them, the massive dragons of Black of Ninth were trying their best to do the same. But someone else had been watching. And even as the first Blacks began to win free of the range of the guns, sudden crossbow fire ripped them from the air. Cursing aloud, Colonus turned Lalen toward the source of the volley. He cursed again at the sight before him. The remaining battleships and frigates of the Newport Sky Fleet sweeping in from above toward the forts in attack formation, weapons blazing fire. This time the Draconin didn't wait for orders. If those ships weren't driven back, all of the Black of Ninth would be wiped out. With one gesture of his spear, he sent all 200 dragons of his battalion surging toward the Arady skyships. Whoever was in command had expected that, however, and all 9 of the frigates turned to meet his battalion, and the wing lancers he'd thought the city didn't have came with them. There were only a handful of lancers, less than 50, but Colonus's hopes died with the sight of them. Nonetheless, he led his Skyborn into the teeth of the skyships and their winged guardians, trying desperately to break through, to open a gap that would allow any of the Black of Ninth to escape. After a moment, the battle narrowed itself down to himself and Lalen, and trying to stay alive. The wing lancers' rocks danced their way around his dragons, but he saw some of those dances end in fire and knew his men were giving their best. Even as he saw rocks die, however, a lancer came plummeting in at Lalen. Before their joined mind could react, the air raid threw a javelin hard. The steel-tipped lance scored along Lalen's side, leaving black ichor to ooze out onto her scales. The wound was minor, however, and didn't stop the bond twisting in the air and burning the rock from the sky. Colonus felt nothing but satisfaction as the great bird disintegrated under the fire and its rider's scream echoed through the air. Another javelin slicing through the air interrupted his satisfaction as it sank deep into Lalen's back, barely missing his own leg. With a curse, Colonus reached down and yanked the shaft free. The dragon's roar of pain echoed loudly in his ears, but the wound was less restrictive on her motions than the shaft would have been, which was good. For a moment later, one of the frigates came into range of the bond and opened fire. The dragon only barely avoided the cannonball that shot through the air where she'd been a moment before. Her scream now was of rage, and Colonus let her rage flow through the bond and into him. With a battle roar of his own, he kneed Lalen toward the offending frigate. He knew through her senses that other dragons had fallen in around him, and he led them in a spiraling attack on the frigate. Fire tore along the ship's wooden sides, and its cannon roared back in reply. A single thought directed Lalen in closer, and she flamed the cannon all along one broadside. Explosions rocked the ship, tearing half of the ship away as the fire powder ignited. The skyship turned away, but Colonus spotted a glint of light off of crystal through the smoke and led Lalen in a swooping dive through the smoke. He only saw the crystals of the ship's lift rooms for a moment, but that was enough. Fire seared across the crystals, shattering the carefully aligned patterns and unleashing the energy pent up in them. Green fire immolated the ship, turning its entire hull and crew into little more than fine ash on the wind. The same fire seared across Colonus and Lalen, and this time the dragon screamed in real pain before the Draconin brought her clear, breathing hard as he broke clear of the smoke. As he did, his eye fell on another frigate drifting away, its deck aflame as its crew struggled to either bring the dying vessel to a safe landing or at least keep it from hitting the city. With a cold grin, he turned his attentions elsewhere, trying to find enemies to kill. There were none. It was over. Even as he searched, all 7 surviving frigates suddenly withdrew, and the remaining wing lancers pounced on and slaughtered the squadron of Skyborn that tried to follow. It took Colonus a long moment to realize why, and then his eyes were drawn to the sky close to the forts. The 5 battleships were moving away under the cover of the inner fort's guns, where no dragon could reach them. Not a single dragon of the Black of Ninth remained in the air. Eric surveyed the Square of the Gods with something akin to shock. The surviving Draconan infiltrators had fled when the forts started blasting dragons from the sky, but hundreds had died, their bodies being hastily cleared aside by the Air 80 soldiers as he watched. Scattered across the square, however, were the bodies no human could easily move. At least 40, possibly even more, of the dragons that had been shot down had landed in the Square of the Gods. Some were even still alive, though likely not for long, given their injuries, and lashed out at anything that approached them in a pain-induced fog. But even dead black dragons were impressive obstacles. "Can we move the dragons?" Icarus asked quietly from behind Eric. "They're blocking our archers' lines of fire." "Yes," Eric replied, "but not easily. We cannot afford the time. Besides," he shrugged, "they'll break up the claws ranks, and that is not a gift I'll lightly decline." He didn't even need to look at the older air raid to feel the man's tension. "Ignore the dragons and form the men up," he instructed. "Keep the archers back to fire if we can, but we need a solid shield wall across the square." "I don't know if we have enough men," the non-com admitted. "Soldiers are trickling in, and I'm shoving into line as they do, but most of these men have never trained together, let alone fought together," Eric finished. He finally turned to face Icarus squarely. Doing so, he caught a glimpse of movement over the other air raid's shoulder and gestured the non-com to silence. Men came spilling into the square in relatively neat lines. Not what a fully functional battalion, even of militia, should have managed, but still neat. Still better than most of the battalions Eric had seen today. The handful of signal bearers bore the flag of the 2nd Kirman Battalion. Eric hesitated for a moment and then gestured to Icarus. "Continue organizing the men. I'll meet them." "Yes, sir," Icarus said. "Good luck, sir," he continued. "You may need it. Kirman follows Jairus, and the Sept has tried to keep its regiment under officers of the family." Eric said nothing. Kalanis barely waited until his dragons were clear of the forts before dragging the crystal tablet out again. He took a moment to breathe and regain control of his temper, and then wrote on it. "We have to move against those forts," he wrote swiftly. "As long as they're intact, we can't deal with the inner city." "Patience, Major," came the almost instant reply, again in the general's own hand. "Wait." The Skyborn waited with bad grace for the several moments until more writing appeared, this time in a clerk's hand, suggesting that the general was having it sent to all of the Skyborn commanders. "We have suffered a setback, but it is far from over," the word said plainly. "While we can defeat the forts or the skyships with ease on their own, the price of defeating them in combination is far too high for us to accept." The tablet stayed the same for a moment, allowing the general's words to sink in. "While the price for taking the forts by dragon could be paid, there is no need," Kalanis' commander finally continued. "The defenders of the shipyards are almost finished. Detachments of the claws of the dragon are already being deployed against the handful of soldiers who bar our way. Once they have dealt with sufficient of the forts to clear us away into the city, Newport will be ours." It was with bared teeth and a far better mood that Kalanis swung Lalan around, allowing him to look at the neat and deadly columns of soldiers moving into the city. The man in charge of the 2nd Kirman turned out to be a lieutenant. Despite the situation, he was impeccably turned out in the dress uniform of a regular officer. Everything about the man, from the perfect uniform to the hair, exactly the length of the current style, set Eric's teeth on edge. On the other hand, the man had several hundred regulars with him, so Eric swallowed his annoyance and stepped forward to meet the man. Before Eric could say a word, the lieutenant came to attention and saluted. "Lieutenant Natan Sept Kirman, reporting with the 2nd Kirman, sir," he snapped off. "I don't think that's entirely necessary, Lieutenant," Eric said dryly. "Especially as technically the regular lieutenant outranked his own militia captaincy." The man only half relaxed at Eric's words, still remaining stiff. "I brought my men as soon as your messengers reached us. Where do you want us?" he asked simply. Realizing to his surprise that the lieutenant was accepting his authority, Eric was taken aback for a moment. "Hold your archers back with the others in the center of the square. Move the rest of your men to..." He paused, turning to survey his own formation. "The left flank. They'll be facing the largest stretch of open ground, where the Draconan formations will be most intact. And you're the only regulars we've got," he explained. "Understood," Natan said calmly. Thank you, sir. The lieutenant turned away and gestured to the other men with him, passing on Eric's orders quickly and efficiently. As his couriers and subordinates scattered, the lieutenant turned back to Eric. We're on the opposite sides of politics, my Lord Septon, he murmured. I won't pretend otherwise, but today the outer forts are gone. The shipyards are burnt. My men may be the only intact regular formation left. Our politics do not matter. The shipyards? Eric asked in shock. Most of the regulars had muster point there. Natan replied quietly. We were heading there when your messenger intercepted us, but from the smoke, we weren't going to make it in time to help. Eric inclined his head to the air raid. You did the right thing coming here, he told the junior man softly. We can worry about politics after we've thrown the Draconans back into the sea. It took the Draconans 15 priceless minutes to get the first wave converged on the square. Eric took full advantage of that time, pulling together his formations and throwing up what crude fortifications they could. The scattering of trenches and berms wasn't much, but it would hopefully help slow down the formations the dragons' bodies would break up. Finally, however, his scouts came running back into the square, passing through narrow lanes to reach Eric's position, gasping for breath. They didn't need to report, however, as their very presence said everything that needed to be said. Form up! He bellowed from where he stood, roughly halfway between the shield line and the archers. The command echoed down the line as sergeants and junior officers repeated it, and the men who'd been out of the line digging quickly fell back into formation. An eerie silence descended over the square, through which could be heard dragon cries and the crackling sound of burning houses. Then, cutting through the silence, came a steady thud, like a drum. No one in the Square of the Gods thought it was any such thing, and Eric could feel the tension as the men's hands shifted on their sword hilts. Finally, the first even and glittering lines of the claws of the dragon came into view. Easily 110 men abreast and 5 deep. They advanced in even step, their feet hitting the ground simultaneously with a horrifying thud. Present arms! Eric ordered, and again the order echoed down the line. There was something viscerally disturbing about the sound of almost 1,000 swords being drawn simultaneously, and Eric shivered as he turned to the archers. In their case, however, he delegated the command to Icarus, and he simply nodded to the non-com before turning back to face the oncoming claws. The first block of 550 Draconans was followed by 3 more, making their attackers a full regiment over 2,000 claws. The sight of that many soldiers moving in step was awe-inspiring. On the other hand, so were Aradi archers. Ready? Eric heard. Hey! Eric heard Icarus bellow behind him as he judged the distance to the Draconan regiments himself. Aim! The non-com continued, as the even ranks entered the square and the Aradi soldiers lifted their own shields and swords. Loose! Even before Icarus had finished bellowing, 600 arrows were in the air. 3 seconds later, before the first salvo even landed, 600 more followed. The first salvo struck like a hammer,